Welcome to Let's Make a Game, a channel about making computer role-playing games using the free program Twine and the Sugarcube format for Twine. In this video, I'm going to continue the series on combat, and this time we're going to look at morale, the mechanic where the enemy at particular points in the fight might decide that they have had enough and run away, and therefore hand victory to the player characters. So first of all, I'll show how it works in a group combat, and then we'll look at the code. So as you can see, the enemies have the initiative. So I'm going to click through this sort of fairly quickly. So it's our turn. We're not doing terribly well, but we have scored 1 wound. Alright, so one of our characters is dead. Okay. Alright. Okay, so we have killed 1 enemy, and the way that I have set up morale is that the enemies will make a morale check after after the first one of them is killed, and after at least half of them are killed. And they'll make that check. They don't make it straight away, but they make it at the start of their turn. So this character, Bold Cypress Tree, has just killed an enemy. Now it's this character that the elves attack. He will have an attack, and then the enemies will roll for morale, or the system will generate a random number anyway. So let's see what happens. So we miss, and we get the message: your foes regard you with grim determination, and which means that they've made their morale check, and we are in a fair bit of trouble. And if we had that option, we would probably take the option to run away at this point. So let's have a look at the code that makes that possible. So first of all, let's look at, as you can see, there aren't any new pages compared to last time. The new code is all in here in the victory check. Oh no, sorry, it's not. It's in on the next attacker page. So let's look at the variables that are going to be most relevant to this. So the first one is O for over, or $O. That starts at 0 and it's set to 1 when the combat is over. And the purpose of that is that there are certain things that you don't want displayed if the combat's over. So for example, when it's your attack, the pictures of the enemies are all links that the player can click on to choose to attack them. Well, obviously, if they've run away, that doesn't make any sense. So we keep track of that with O. And then we have a couple of variables that relate specifically to morale. We have MO, which is the percentage chance of the enemy passing any given morale check. I've just set it at 50 as a sort of middling number. And MC, for, I guess, standing for morale check, which is the number of morale checks that we've made so far. So it knows not to make the same morale check, more than once. So let's look at the code. And as I say, the code is in the next attacker page. And the relevant part of this page adds 1 to this variable $CA. $CA stands for current attacker, and basically what it's doing is saying, all right, enemy number 2 has had their attack. Well, now it's enemy number 3's turn, and so of course normally what we do is just add 1. Add 1 to $CA. Which is what plus plus means. And there are a few little special cases, like if let's say enemy 2 has had their attack and now it's enemy 3's attack, but enemy 3's dead, well obviously they don't get an attack.
So that's what this code does. I've gone through all this before, but I'll just go through it briefly. So the bit that is relevant is the bit when when $AT, which is the variable that says which side is attacking, is equal to 0, and when $AT is equal to 0, that means that it's the player character's attack. But $CA is greater than $C. So what that means is the C is the variable that says how many player characters there are. So it's saying that the current attacker is, say, 5, but there are only 4 characters. And that tells the computer that, well, actually that means that every character has had their attack, and so therefore it's no longer the character's attack. We need to change it over to the enemy's attack, which is what we do down here. We set $CA to be 1, we set $AT to be 1, and we set $DE to be 0, meaning that the attacker is the monsters and the defender is the player characters. We add something to $M, which is the variable that's the message that will display on the screen. And in this case, we add a line break, and then we add your foes have the initiative, so letting you know that it's not your go anymore. And we set the current attacker to 1, because of course the first enemy will be the first one to attack. But before we do that, we may need to check morale, and that's the new code that we've got here. So if CA is greater than C and AT is equal to 0, so if it's the end of the player character's attack, and within that we have if $MC is less than 2. In other words, if there have been less than 2 morale checks, then we may need to check morale. So the first thing we do is we check how many enemies are dead, if any, and that's fairly straightforward. We set Z to 0. We have a for loop, which starts at 1 and goes up to $E, which is the number of enemies. And then if $H square bracket 1 n square bracket $Y n square bracket is less than 1, in other words, if enemy number Y has less than 1 hit point, which means that they're dead, then we set Z, or set $Z++. In other words, we add 1 to the value of Z. Then, and this is just a long note that talks about when the morale checks are made. The first check happens once any enemy is dead. The second one happens when at least half of the enemies are dead. Only 1 morale check can happen per round, so you might get a really good round and kill 3 of them when none of them were dead before. Well, that means you'll have a morale check in 1 round, and then the next round you'll have another morale check if the enemies make the first one and don't run away, of course. And don't make a morale check if every enemy is dead. Again, if you do really well and kill 4 of them in 1 hit, there's no point making a morale check if you've managed to sort of kill them all. So that's what this, basically all of that is encapsulated in this quite long line of code, which is if $Z is less than $E, in other words, if the number of dead enemies is less than the total number of enemies, or to put it another way, if there's any enemy left alive, and at least one of these 2 things are true. We've got nested brackets here. So we've got bracket, bracket, then some code, end bracket, or bracket, some more code, end bracket, end bracket. And what all that means is if this is true, there's at least 1 enemy alive, and one of these is true, or both of them can. Well, both of them can't be true because they've got contradictory requirements, but logically they could both be true, or in this case just means if at least one of those things is true. If $MC is equal to 0 and Z is over 0, in other words, if we haven't made any morale checks and there's at least 1 dead enemy, or if MC is equal to 1 and Z times 2 is over or equal to enemy.
if Z times 2 is over or equal to $E. What that means is if we've made one morale check, and if we multiply the number of dead enemies by 2, we get at least the total number of starting enemies. In other words, if at least half of the enemies have been killed, well, then we'll make the second morale. So this code is, if that's true, we'll be making the second morale check, and if this code is true, we'll be making the first morale check. So if any of those things are true, then we set MC++, we increment the number MC to indicate that we've made another morale check. And then the actual morale check is quite simple. That the code for deciding whether to make one is much more complicated than the morale check itself. If random bracket 1, 100 end bracket is greater than $MO, in other words, if a random number from 1 to 100 is greater than the morale value, which in this case I've set to 50, then they failed their morale check, in which case we set $O to 1, and we add something to $M, which says your foes flee in terror. That's what happens if they fail the morale check, and then if they make the morale check, we don't change anything except we add something to M, which is your foes regard you with grim determination, and that's just a little note to the player that says the enemies have made a morale check and they've succeeded. And I could have just said your enemies have made your morale check, but I wanted something that was a bit more sort of in the fiction of the story. You may find it sort of clearer to just say enemies make a morale check and pass or something. But either way, so having made a morale check, if we need to make a morale check, then we do all this stuff if $O is equal to 0. In other words, if the fight is not over, if the enemies haven't run away or been killed, then we set the current attacker to 1, we set the attacking side to be the monsters, we set the defending side to be the player characters, and we add to $M to say your foes have the initiative. And then we continue on to display as we did last time. So that is how morale checks work, and it's quite swingy, by which I mean there's a single random roll, and it could mean that your foes run away and you win the combat straight away, or it could mean that they don't. And that's a deliberate choice. It's quite random, and the difference between the random outcomes is quite big, and that is a deliberate choice. You can go into a combat against overwhelming odds, but then you kill one of them, and they fail the morale check, and they all run away. And so it was a good gambit. But then if you're unlucky and they don't make their morale check, if you're unlucky and they do make their morale check, well then you've sort of got yourself into trouble that you might not have expected. So you might have in a game, perhaps you have enemies like goblins or something like that, where there's lots of them, and they can be quite deadly, but they have very low morale. So therefore, you might go, we'll go into combat with them, and they'll probably run away. But then you can be unlucky. So I made a sort of deliberate choice that I wanted to have a sort of swingy system, where an unpredictable system. Whether you prefer it like that or whether you like something more predictable, I don't know. I also wanted a fairly simple system. You could have any number of complexities in terms of the morale. It's just a simple random number from 1 to 100 compared to a preset value. But you could say, well, add to it if the player characters outnumber the enemies, will then decrease their morale temporarily. If there's a wizard who's cast a spell and they're a monster that's frightened of magic, well then that could affect their morale. If they're you could have all sorts of sort of more realistic options. You could have particular types of monsters that are sort of particular foes of particular types of characters. So you could say, well, goblins and dwarves hate each other, so therefore if you're fighting goblins and you have a dwarf in your party, well, that will increase the morale of your enemies that will make them more likely to want to fight. You could have particular types of character that are sort of quite terrifying to particular, perhaps goblins are frightened of elves or something, and so therefore that lowers their morale if there's an elf in the party. But what I've done is, as usual, the sort of the most basic, simple version of it, and then you can add complexity to it if you feel that fits the game that you want to make. So that's the enemies running away. Of course, we also have to code, or I would like to code, the option for the player characters to run away if they get themselves into a situation and feel like they're going to end up, dead unless they retreat. It might be better to have an option to run away as well. And that's what I'll be doing in a future video. But I hope that what I did today was interesting or useful to at least some of you, and I hope you will tune in next time.